expression of our karaoke style presentation because the lapel mic has lost its power. Yeah, unlike Clive and Gerhard, I don't have serious credentials in cultural astronomy whatsoever. I'm just a guy who's been hanging around and was unable to say no too many times. So I've been roped into doing things that are normally outside my specific expertise. But the reason why I'm giving you the presentation here is that as a historian and philosopher of science, I come to learn that philosophy of science has quite a lot to offer to the field, but for some reason doesn't. So in particular, the question about the relation between these indigenous knowledges and modern science is something that typically creates quite a bit of controversy, and especially in public debate, also quite a lot of, say, insecurity by researchers in the field that come from the sciences and how to talk about it, what kind of language to use. Even though many of the issues are, from a philosophical perspective, rather trivial, actually, in the very meaningful, original sense of the word, meaning, yes, it's basically elementary stuff that you can solve quite quickly. So, typically when you come to the question, yes, is indigenous knowledge science? You find very passionate yes or no answers. I would say, is it really such a meaningful question? And should we rather talk about that in very different ways? So I apologize also for the slides, given that I will talk about philosophy, hardly any images in here. But what I want to do is present a form of language we embedded in, here's what you could call theories, with philosophical concepts that can quite usefully be applied here. The problem is, or one of the issues is those kind of concepts have not been developed with indigenous knowledges in mind, but rather for solving very different issues in philosophy of science, but nonetheless they can be used in here, because frankly, the discussion of indigenous knowledge in philosophy of science is in its infancy. If I've counted correctly, the number of philosophers of science working in the field is 2, which it's much better than 5 years ago when it was just Alice Navalny. But okay, I may have overlooked somebody here. So what I will talk a little bit about is general questions about what science is, look at the relation between indigenous knowledge and modern sciences, come to the philosophical, actually much more interesting question, what knowledge is, and then talk about epistemic or scientific pluralism that was just mentioned.
That's all good.
Sorry. And finally, yes, because I have astronomy in the title towards the end, talk about why astronomy might be a particularly interesting question. So yes, what is science? An interesting question that kept quite a lot of people busy. It's actually quite a recent question, because once upon a time that question was straightforward, because science was the production of true and verifiable knowledge that would lead to continuous growth of knowledge over time. An idea developed sometime in the 17th century and working quite well. Did a lot of good, did a lot of bad things. Gas warfare, eugenics, scientific racism came out of that as well. But then along came Albert Einstein with his theory of relativity and slightly later quantum physics, and that killed off the idea for good. And I think it is quite important to first see this idea might still be around. It's a zombie. Nobody in their work practice in science works about this, even though in the public depiction of science, it's quite often there. So then philosophers of science got the job to say, can we define what science is if it's not that? And not many philosophers of science spent a lot of time on this, and they failed miserably. In a progressive sense, of course, they were spectacularly successful in doing a lot of work on that, coming with lots of ideas. Interesting, but for this kind of demarcation problem, as that can be known after Karl Popper, the way how to distinguish between science and non-science turned out to be a bit of a red herring. Basically, as the philosopher Larry Lawton put it in the 1980s, the quest for a specifically scientific form of knowledge or for a demarcation criterion between science and non-science has been an unqualified failure. There is apparently no epistemic feature of such features which all and only the sciences exhibit. Our aim should be rather to distinguish reliable and well-tested claims to knowledge from bogus ones. Here you see the interesting, what reliable knowledge is a more interesting question, and we'll come back to that at one point. Of course, we can define science empirically. We just look at how science is practiced, how modern science is practiced in particular. And the reason for this is simply, science is not a natural kind. It's not just out there as something that can be clearly defined like stars, for example. I'll leave it to the astronomers that probably say you're not hopelessly naive because there are lots of problems defining them as well. But basically, modern science as we know it, I'll skip my tirade why I don't like the idea of Western in this. There are multiple reasons why I think the word Western should not be used here. Modern science is the much better form. Is a product of human activity, of centuries of work by a large number of people. Therefore, it has become culturally complex and is thus difficult to pin down. It is, as a separate category, again, quite recent, about 200 years old. And so we can have the empirical definitions of science, and I will go into them at the moment. In a moment, we'll have no clear epistemic logic behind it. We have functional logic from that we can use cultural theory to define this and the functionalities of science and societies. And so, what's important here, right, is the word science, particularly in the English language, has a lot of ideological cloud or a sense of belonging by people who are affirmative about science. And we can say this is a silly thing, but I don't think it's a fruitful approach. We need to take this kind of cultural belonging very seriously when we talk to scientists and we talk with scientists, especially in public debate about this. But just to give you one example, when we try to define science on a conceptual level, people have tried that. The approach that I suggest here is virtually the only scientific institution in the English-speaking world that I could find that tried to define science was the British Science Council. We get by saying science is the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. Wow. A lot of words, but what does it mean? And of course, the trick is what is systematic methodology? Because typically what you get is an argument, oh yes, but we have this scientific method. What is the scientific method? Okay, the British Science Council, and I don't want to knock this definition down. It is some good work that has gone in there, but if you look at what their footnote in defining the scientific method is, scientific methodology includes the following, and the whole list of things is possibly using, but not necessarily using mathematics, maybe experiments or observations. So lots of things, and Daniel Hicoroa from New Zealand has put on that as an article, yes, if you apply that kind of definition to indigenous knowledge, yes, you get in there. It doesn't mean that much because there are so many things that you can get in there as well. My classic example is stamp collecting. Yeah, definitely is a science for this point. So at that point, yes, going that way is maybe not the way to go forward. So let's talk about the relation of indigenous knowledges. When I want to talk about that, just as a brief introduction, I don't want to bore you too much with this, but we have the idea that defining indigenous knowledges as basically the knowledge of indigenous people which is not quite as trivial because it juxtaposes that with the knowledge of the colonizers. And quite often that means modern scientific knowledge. And so that kind of juxtaposition isn't there, which means when we talk about indigenous knowledges, we talk automatically about the power relation between different kinds of knowledge. And that's important to keep in mind. Otherwise, it can be vastly different. And my main hat is actually that one of an early modern historian of science and philosophy, and I work a lot on European traditional knowledge and its relation to early modern science. And many of the things that we look at, we find in the debate between indigenous knowledge and science, we also find in early modern, say, craft knowledge. Other things are quite different. Mainly, I think, speaking as a German who has come to Australia, is that the presence of indigenous knowledge within Australia shapes the Australian idea on any traditional knowledge, including European traditional knowledge, in a way that I find quite staggering. So yes, talking about indigenous knowledge and science, and it comes with a lot of debates about this because the word science has this particular prestige. You can look at, and here I'm going to the empirical definition, well, it's kind of what is actually science doing? And basically, yes, science can be seen as broadly an institution within society to establish truth, to evaluate knowledge claims, and especially for the basic categories of social life, time, calendars, systems of weights and measures, for example, anything that we use on a daily basis. But also providing expert advice on what is the case, and as such, science, modern science is seen as central to modern societies. It's basically, we couldn't run our society without science, and even the most anti-science people are actually quite clever with a lot of science, even if they don't like evolutionary biology, climate science, or any kind of other things that science might have done. But of course, that doesn't mean that much to begin with. So, if we take that kind of very broad definition of science again, in any reasonably complex society, and yes, I was quite happy for the discussion of complexity. I don't want to talk more about this, but any society of above a certain size will have some form of institution that is more or less structured in ways to look at this kind of knowledge and being in a way that, okay, we have somebody here. Nonetheless, the particular criteria that are set towards science or the demands that are put on what might be definable as science can vary differently. And they actually are constantly dynamic and evolving. If you look at European or North American societies in the 19th and 20th century, you will find that there was actually quite a lot of shift in both the methods used in science, but also what science was expected to do within the society. And so thinking of that is static, is dynamic. One of the basic reference, I think we would say that whatever knowledge is produced by whatever we call science in a certain society has to correspond with what is perceived as reality. That is some way of a correspondence. If it doesn't work, there is no reason why we should keep on working with it. At least in principle, any practical instance of, or any specific instance of. So in this way, yes, we can talk about indigenous science. If we say, okay, we look at those kind of institutions, and of course, if you talk about a small group with 1,000 people, it's a very different thing than if you talk about a country with 25 million. You have very different institutions with very different demands. That doesn't tell you much, but in this way, it is not in itself a very meaningful statement that we have indigenous science or indigenous knowledge within indigenous groups. What does it mean for other people, though? Can we talk about indigenous knowledge as science, say indigenous Australian knowledge as non-indigenous Australians? And it's not here to say we want to look for a case of universality, but it is on a very different level that we need to talk about here, because we need to understand what kind of role do we think indigenous people play in the post-colonial society of Australians today. So and that is a conversation that is not at all on the level of epistemology or philosophy of science. It is a deeply political conversation. Again, when we can say, well, you bring politics in there, we have to say, yes, this kind of what philosophers of science call non-epistemic values in science, we have all the time. Of course, medical science is there because we have values about health. These are not intrinsically epistemic values. A brutal evolutionary biologist would tell you, well, evolution takes care of humanity. Why do we care about health? So, but of course we take here non-epistemic values. In this way, yes, we can have this conversation, we need to have this conversation, but it's not a philosophical conversation we can have. So, I talked about indigenous knowledges, or sometimes even the singular. Philosophers would have said, well, Gerhard, you're tricking us. Well, you can make the claim that it is knowledge. So, before coming into the central part of my talk, I just want to give you a bit of a spiel on a question: what do we mean by knowledge? And are indigenous ways of knowing, as they are sometimes called to avoid that kind of epistemic claim, indeed qualify as proper knowledge? Why philosophers feel a bit more comfortable because we have definitions of knowledge, even though what do I know is typically a very central question. And ultimately, particularly in a culture that has a rather high value of stake in analytic philosophy, you will come to the definition of knowledge as justified true belief that basically, okay, when we say B knows X, we mean three different things. A, we mean that X is true. B, that B believes X. And on the third is that B has justification for believing that X is true. I can believe that it is, so I know that it's raining outside. Yes, I believe this, but I can have my justification for that I looked at the weather faulty weather radar from yesterday and gave me the rain, not by looking at the outside and see the rain corridor. So when we talk about indigenous knowledge, of course the main point is typically not 2 and 3, but how do we know whether X is true or not? And the problem is that most of the time, this is where we resort to modern science. We say, okay, yeah, we have scientific evidence that this was actually the case. And it's very much at the basis that, of course, when we use stellarium, we of course take modern scientific astronomy in there that was at the basis of the program. So this kind of yardstick is something that is very difficult to get at. But there is another problem with knowledge, and that I hope we can get out, that typically, and I have encountered that time and time again, philosophers, and here are philosophers all kinds of variety, will say that knowledge is always propositional knowledge, which means that it is something that can be phrased in terms of I know X. I know that Melbourne is a city in Australia. Yeah. And there have been a lot, and philosophical debates of knowledge always seem to be focused on this kind of propositional knowledge. Mainly, I think, because this is the way that these are the kinds of things that philosophers know, or think they know, but unfortunately also because philosophy, since ancient Greece, and in the same way I think that is also true for Chinese philosophy, has been used in terms of political power, and in that, or has been established, not just used, but established as a manifestation of certain political power, which led to a denigration of any other forms of knowledge claims that might come from different states. And so do other forms of knowledge exist? And typically the kind of classic medieval scholastic debate is, yes, if you only have knowledge if you know the causes of things, if you have know how, you know how to do certain things, that is not proper knowledge. It could be pointed down to skills and to non-verbalized knowledge. Thankfully, at this point, scientists come to the rescue, most notably the Hungarian, later British chemist Michael Polanyi, who realized that many things that go on in scientific laboratories have a lot to do with the production of knowledge, but nothing to do with propositional knowledge that can be verbalized. So the idea of tacit knowledge as gestural knowledge that can come in here, that is something that is not just skill, but that you learn certain procedures, certain gestures, and these are inherent of the work in the laboratory. And without knowing them, it is impossible to do an experimental scientist's job. And in this way, I think we are, and over the last 40 years, historians of science have, particularly in the field of experimental history of science, pointed out lots of this kind of examples for where certain knowledge was coming from. One of these classic examples is the British physicist James Joule was also a beer brewer, and this beer brewing knowledge was vital for getting establishing the mechanical equivalent of heat, one of the foundations to the modern principle of conservation of energy. So those kind of forms of knowledge exist and need to be taken seriously. And of course, in many indigenous cultures, we'll come to the idea that this is part and parcel of how knowledge is transmitted, because it's very typical in for any kind of learning in that sense. Also, thankfully, the introduction of statistical reasoning has gotten rid of the need to always have causal knowledge for scientific evidence. Medical science accepts evidence on statistical reasoning, even if you don't know the particular causal mechanism why a certain drug works. If it works, we can have the efficacy established. It works, which means that the hanging towards causal knowledge is not. Okay, so that was a lot of preliminary. I'm sorry about this. Just to get to the main point of epistemic pluralism or scientific pluralism. So I mentioned in my opening the demarcation debate is over. Basically, we had a student here in HBS in 15 years who wrote a thesis, has Larry Lawton killed the demarcation debate? The answer, because her supervisor didn't really want to have the answer to be yes, said, no, there are still problems unsolved. Yes, the problem that's unsolved is that we haven't found a way to demarcate science. Some philosophers of science still maintain that it's important to keep the demarcationist tradition up, that we will need to have clear criteria to define science. That has got a bit more traction over the past 15 years, mainly due to political debates, first starting with gravism in the US and then later on with this climate change debates. So yes, we said we need to find those kind of principles. And quite often, no, almost inevitably, such a definition will rule out indigenous knowledge from science and say this is something completely different. We need to understand this position exists. It's a minority, it's a clear minority position in philosophy of science today. But that doesn't mean that they are wrong. It needs to be taken seriously. It is much more prominent in public debate. Part of that might just be this kind of lag that you typically have, that it takes academic debates a few decades to permeate into public awareness. And certainly, say, scientists around my age who would have studied maybe 30, 40 years ago, unfortunately not 40 years than 30, would have maybe have taken philosophy of science class where they were given kind of this, the idea of the demarcation debate as a central point for philosophy of science, and now no, we need to uphold this. The argument very clearly runs in the way that science, after all, is a system, is a coherent system of knowledge. Yes, scientists may use different methods because it's awfully hard for astronomers to experiment with black holes, which, botanists can't really do that much with complex mathematics in their field. But these methods are closely related, and most importantly, they do not contradict each other. And therefore, science can be demarcated from other forms of knowledge and should actually do this. And knowledge claims from outside science do not have a place in science. We may not found a simple demarcation criterion, but we can work on it and maybe we can. Okay, against this, and again, that hasn't come at all from work with indigenous knowledge. Feminist philosophy of science had a bit of an impact in that, but it also has come from other angles, is the development of the idea of epistemic or scientific pluralism. Basically, epistemic pluralism says that when we look at scientific research, we should allow for very different methodological approaches, very different methods to be used, and that multiple systems of knowledge within a scientific discipline can coexist side by side. The basic reasoning goes as something like as follows, that if we say use a look at quantum mechanics and botany, we'll find very, very different methods used. There's very little connection between the two. We don't actually know whether they don't contribute to each other. And indeed, biologists, especially evolutionary biologists, are adamant that biology is not a subset of chemistry. It's something independent. So, this is something that, okay, physicists, our background originally is in physics, yes, physicists sometimes still claim that ultimately we're the fundamental of everybody. But ultimately, most scientists are very happy to agree to this kind of distinction between radical breaks with that you can't just reduce one science to another. That also means that there is no universal method in science. There are different methods used in science. That goes back to this kind of idea, or that Larry Lawton, which is basically a best practice approach. We have a certain problem, or field of problems, and we use whatever methods we have. We found as the best methods, and we use them. Nothing magic about it, it's just classic craftsmanship. So, but here's where epistemic pluralism comes in. Now, if you accept this kind of different methods between different scientific disciplines, is there a good reason why you should accept different methods within a scientific discipline? Because, while we still want to have a best practice approach, we don't quite know what the best practice is necessarily. There are established practices, and there are more or less active practices. Quite often it's found, yeah, okay, somehow this seems to be working quite well. Let's try this. Try different new methodological approaches. And if two approaches contradict one another or seem to be at odds with each other, there is no reason to make an automatic judgment call, oh no, this can't be accepted. Have people sit side by side. One of the classic objections that comes to this, oh, if you open that one, can't anybody get in? And is this kind of epistemic pluralism not kind of classic ontological relativism? That basically, yeah, well, it's only relative with respect to a specific social system, and there's no truth outside this kind of particular social system. And if we accept that, science can no longer fulfill its role in modern society. Because how can we judge knowledge claims? Isn't this kind of classic idea of anything goes? Yeah. If you allow scientists to do everybody, yeah. If we allow indigenous knowledge in there, yes, how can we keep out the young earth creationists? And it's a good question, but we can think about it in somewhat other terms. So, the term is here that we think of, in any given field of science, just to have multiple systems of practice going side by side. Again, this is not originally thought of with indigenous knowledge in mind, but there might be a place here. It doesn't mean anything goes, but rather multiple things goes. It is, so you don't ask the question, what if X could come in? Young earth creationists, anti-vaxxers, take your favorite enemy and say, well, they come in here. No, we talk about specific claims that we say that are dealt with on a case-by-case basis. It is something when you say, okay, we have a conversation, what is permissible here, what should we, yes, who should we allow to sit on the table? Again, that goes back to the question about what kind of role do we want indigenous people of a country to have playing in the country? It is not a question about what if the indigenous person is also a young earth creationist. Probably sure that is somewhere. But, this is not the issue that is to be debated. We ask specific questions. So, yes, we can basically say we don't end up in another demarcation debate. Because when we talk about indigenous knowledge in, say, the science faculty of any university, we don't talk about principal ideas of agreement. It's just kind of thing, how can we accommodate indigenous knowledge in this particular setting? We're not talking about anything else or any other potential forms of indigenous knowledge. Nonetheless, and this goes back to a point that Gerhard made, it based on much more experience than I have, because he says, look to this very much from an abstract philosophical point of view, that we come here that modern science and indigenous knowledges are definitely not on the same level in terms of power hierarchies in our society. Not even in the most, maybe there. I know there are countries that are better on this than Australia is. I'm not quite sure whether, but certainly, typically, I would be curious to learn whether there is a country that spends as much on indigenous knowledge development as it spends on science. I doubt that is the case. So yes, we get the baggage of political power in there. And of course, and this is something that in the debate, when I say look at the Mataranga Maori debate in New Zealand over the past years, we see in this kind of science, in the sense of belonging, people who work in science often have a very ideal type of image of science. It does so many good things. It does, but it does also horrible things. And certainly when we talk about the colonization process after 1700, science cannot claim to be an innocent bystander. It was part and parcel of the colonization project and used in many ways for this. You would hope that science is better today. It probably is. But the idea that science is always just for the good of the people is unfortunately naive. And try to break it gently to people who believe that they are doing such fantastic work, not necessarily. And the problem is here, indeed, one in that I'm not qualified to answer, I can just flag the problem, is modern science. One of the reasons why modern science is successful is because it is relationist. So it tends to evaluate non-scientific knowledge claims and is very happy to accept them. So this is more my expertise. If you look at, say, early modern botany, there's so much indigenous knowledge that has gone in there that was completely, of course, wiped out in the process. And unfortunately, I can't quite see that modern science has safeguards against put in place against this. So the idea that, or the vision that such a process of getting indigenous knowledge is very close to modern scientific research leads to another eradication of traditional knowledge systems is one. And again, as Gerhard pointed out, this is very much where you are the people that are responsible as in-betweens, go-betweens. And you need to put the safeguards in there that makes it clear. It's nothing that is... Yeah. So yes, how to protect it. Okay. Finally, I come to astronomy. So because I think astronomy is a particularly well-suited case here to look for this. It's not the only one. Medical science, of course, has realized that, at least over the past decades, that people are sometimes different. So, yeah, indigenous knowledges might be really helpful when we're dealing with indigenous health medicine in particular. But astronomy is very useful here, because if we look at the link between modern science and indigenous knowledges. Because first, for three reasons. First of all, the object of inquiry in astronomy is rather straightforward. The modern disciplines of physics and chemistry are basically artifacts of cultural historical processes that happened in Europe in the end of the 18th century, where certain things ended up in chemistry and physics. It's quite contingent, there's no internal logic. So the disciplines have been based on these kind of contingent decisions. I would be surprised if you find indigenous cultures that have a very similar definition of fields that could be linked with that to us. Astronomy, with one exception, is much more straightforward in the way that as we look at things in the sky. The exception is that for, again, culturally contingent reasons, astrology parted ways from astronomy in the middle of the 17th century in Europe, and that distinction is one that is foundational to modern scientific astronomy, whereas in many indigenous cultures we never had this kind of distinction that was being made. I don't want to go into the epistemic questions about that, but certainly it's kind of one thing that comes in there, but typically that baggage is not true. More importantly, that would surprise you that astronomy is unusual among the sciences, that it has never had what I would call a fundamental epistemic rupture, kind of full break with the past. You might say, hang on, was Copernicus doing something there? But that was just a shift in theory. There was not a shift in methods of science. And astronomers have never discarded historical data. If you want to ask a chemist to seriously go into a chemical manuscript of the 13th century to get some data for their chemical research, they will laugh at you. astronomers go back to ancient Babylonian data, go back to ancient Chinese data, and once you accept them, why would you reject? Why would you want to reject indigenous star knowledge? There is, unless you are a hardcore racist, sorry, there is no reason for this. So there is no good reason for this. There's only bad reason for this. And indeed, astronomers are typically, as I have perceived them, fairly open to this. I think definitely more open than if I talk to physicists that I know. But that is something which would say that there were never these kind of modernist predispositions that were there, that are there in physics or chemistry. It all started with Galileo, I think before, it all started with Lavoisier before. So at that point. And the final one is, yes, we have the emergence of propulsion astronomy as a field that actually provides this kind of link. Just looked yesterday, there are now people who do the field called cultural physics, but as far as I can see by academic publications, it's 3. And they're very obviously following the model of cultural astronomy. So yes, that much for an overview. I hope that wasn't too boring. Otherwise, yes, unfortunately I can't join you for lunch. I'll be back later at University House if you want to have any questions or have a coffee break. Otherwise, thanks for your attention and enjoy your lunch break.
Thanks, Gerhard. Now, before we go, we're going to head to University House, and we've got box lunches. We have far fewer people who actually showed up than who registered, and I based the number that we were going to get, both of the box lunches and of dinner, based on who signed up. So can I have everybody who's registered for the school is automatically registered for dinner this evening? Raise your hand if you are going to go to dinner. No? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. Good, that means we've got almost 15 people left over. Is anybody bringing a guest? Right?
Does anybody want to bring a guest?
So the result is we now have more dinners paid for and ready. They can't change now. So if people want to come, just let us know. You can bring, who are you pointing at you?
Someone said they wanted to bring a guest.
Yeah, we've got room for a few of those, so we've paid for it. We might as well use it, otherwise it's going to waste.
You know, Dwayne, our group coming up from that we're working with for IAC, Martin and Ruben, those folks, they're supposed to show up for dinner. So what there may be.
Are they here now?
They're going to be here later.
Okay.
So, because we're having a little planning
that's
session,
right.
so they may be here for dinner. Maybe 4 or 5 of them.
If they want to come to this, they can.
I think, yeah.
So we put the option out there. Yes, Gail?
Just because this might be the last opportunity to actually make a give out a notification while everyone's here. Whoever has a laptop is coming tomorrow and it has Windows on it, please bring it with you. Please bring your laptop or any Windows object that can connect to the internet.
Right, so anybody with a Windows machine bring tomorrow because we're going to be utilizing something.
they won't be able to connect to the internet.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
Talking
with about the connectivity.
If you have a laptop, bring your laptop installed with Stellarium installed. The latest version of Stellarium that was only released last weekend. So just
Just bring a machine with Stellarium, especially if you've got a Windows machine.
Is there a pen? I have to write. The Horizon also, yes, install Horizon. Can I write up on it?
We can send out a message to everybody.
Yeah, we'll send out a message about
bring
that.
your laptop with Stellarium installed and also Horizon.
We'll send a message for the link.
Now we've got time now. It's lunchtime, so we're going to head to University House. We have 1 hour. So we're going to come back here at 1:30. We're going to have a 1 hour session, and we're going to head to the planetarium. Look at the beautiful weather we had outside.
Are we locking the doorway or bring our staff?
Okay, we cannot lock the room, so I recommend taking your stuff with you.
Thank you.
I think the book should be fine. If I was going to come in and take the book.
Actually, if anyone wants to, if anyone has something